Up to this point, we've created some basic geometry and added some geometric relationships. In order for the sketch to become fully defined and turn black, the next thing we have to do is add dimensions, which can really control the size of the part. When you add dimensions in SolidWorks, you'll be working with a tool called the Smart Dimension. This type of dimensioning feature is called a smart dimension because it takes care of adding the appropriate dimension based on the geometry you select. Let's start with this vertical dimension here. To add it, I can simply click on the line segment, and SolidWorks adds a distance dimension. Next, I'll click again to place it in the graphics area, and a spin box pops up letting me type in the desired length of the segment. I'll type in 50 millimeters, and I can press Enter or click on the green check. When I do, notice that this sketch turned black up here. It's black because this line segment has a horizontal relation, and it's 50 millimeters above the origin. If I press the Escape key on my keyboard, you can see that I cannot drag this anywhere. If you want to modify a dimension, all you have to do is double-click on it, and the same spin box appears. I can type in 75 millimeters, and the sketch updates. So the dimension is really what's being used to drive the shape of a part. Let's continue on and add the rest of our dimensions. I'll press the S key on the keyboard and access the Smart Dimension tool from here. With this first dimension, I clicked on the vertical line segment. However, you can really select any geometry, and SolidWorks will be able to create the dimension from that. You can also use points or a combination of points and lines to create the dimension. In this case, I'll use a point-to-point dimension between these two endpoints, and SolidWorks creates the distance dimension. I'll click again to place it in the graphics area, type in 50 millimeters, and press Enter. Next, let's add a height dimension here. Again, I can click on this vertical line segment, but to show you one other approach, I can click on this other horizontal line segment, and it switches to a vertical distance dimension. I'll click again to place it, and type 25 millimeters for the distance. As we do this, you can see more of the geometry turning black, which means it's fully defined. Keep an eye on the status bar down here. This lets you know that the sketch is still underdefined, meaning there's still blue geometry. We really want this to say fully defined before we move on and start creating 3D features. I'll continue by adding in a vertical dimension here. Notice when I do this, SolidWorks prompts me, telling me that there's a problem. The reason there's a problem is because this dimension would actually overdefine the sketch. I'll click Cancel to show you why. Remember when we added this relationship here? This told us that the endpoint of this line was coincident with this horizontal line here. And these two height dimensions are actually driving the location of this line up here. So that means the length of this line is really being defined by these two dimensions and the fact that this endpoint is coincident with this horizontal line. Next, let's create the overall width of the part. I'll click on this vertical line segment and click here to give us our overall width. I'll type in 150 millimeters and press Enter. At this point, a lot of the geometry is turning black, and it can sometimes be unclear what dimensions or relationships need to be added in order for the sketch to become fully defined. What I recommend in order to determine which dimensions and relationships to add is to simply click and drag the blue, underdefined geometry. I'll first press Escape on the keyboard to get back to my selection arrow. With this selection arrow, I can click on any of the blue, underdefined geometry and see what's able to move. In the case of this line, I'm unable to move it. But if I click on the endpoint, you can see that it's possible to still move that. So you can see it's free to move side to side, and the other thing that changes is the angle of these lines. So that's a good cue to know what type of dimension to add next. Let's go ahead and add an angular dimension between these two lines. I'll press the S key to bring up the shortcut toolbar and start the Smart Dimension again. To add an angular dimension, all you have to do is select the two segments. And since we're using the Smart Dimension tool, SolidWorks automatically knows to switch this to be an angle. I'll click again to position the dimension and type in 135 degrees. When I do, this line segment turns black. But what needs to be defined still? Again, I'll press Escape on the keyboard to get back to my selection arrow and click and move the geometry. You can see that if I drag the line segment, the geometry only moves in this direction. but if I click on an endpoint, it moves differently. So as a designer, it's up to you to decide how you want this part to behave. You can use a dimension, or perhaps you can use another relation. In this case, maybe we'll make this endpoint vertical with this line segment here. I'll select the endpoint, and I can either select the line segment or the point itself. I'll select the endpoint, and I can choose vertical from the context toolbar. Again, more sketch geometry turns black, with just a single blue line segment remaining. I'll again try to click and move any of the geometry, and I can see that I can only move it in this direction. It's always a good idea to try a combination of points and segments to see what you're able to move. In this case, it's pretty clear what dimension needs to be added, so I'll again launch the Smart Dimension tool, and I'll add a distance on this line segment here. Type in 100 millimeters and press Enter. At this point, SolidWorks tells me that the sketch is fully defined and all the geometry turns black. It's a good idea to pay attention to the status bar, because oftentimes you may have tiny line segments that may not be easily noticeable, even though they're actually blue. In this case, we know our sketch is fully defined, and we can move on to creating our 3D feature.